on a quick... But first, what exactly is the grey zone?
We're neither in a state of peace, nor are we in a state of war, but we're sitting in this very dangerous place between.
Lieutenant General Graham Lamb is a former director of UK Special Forces and a master of unconventional warfare.
Winston Churchill, his famous book one of his recollection of the Second World War was The Gathering Storm. There never was a war in all history easier to prevent by timely action than the one which has just desolated such great areas of the globe. It could have been prevented, in my belief, without the firing of a single shot, but no one would listen. We were all sucked into that awful whirlpool.
General Lamb knows his military history, but he also knows about modern threats and thinks Churchill's observation carries a new relevance today.
This is not a case of a Cold War against China. This is not a new Cold War against Russia. This is the 1930s. And so if we don't recognize that we're in that period, probably about 1930, 31, 32, 33, that we are actually in a gathering storm. And if we do, as we did in that time, merely try and accept that others would act in our best interests when they absolutely by design did not intend to, then don't be surprised if we end up in 1939 and a world war which nearly killed this country and would have changed the global order as we know it.
Graham Lamb isn't someone who issues idle warnings. I first met him in Iraq in 2007 when he was deputy commander of all US-led forces based out there, following the invasion to topple Saddam Hussein. General Lamb has since left the military, but he's still an expert on the world's security threats, in particular, a murky grey zone of harm that deliberately sits under the threshold of what would normally be described as war, though in many ways, this grey zone is no less dangerous than a real conflict zone, and it affects all of us.
I find the terms war and peace absolutely irrelevant. Everybody assumes we're in a peaceful state. Nothing could be further from the truth. We're in a warlike state, but not war as we would look at it from, the Netflix Battle of Midway or Pearl Harbor or something like this. We're not in this titanic struggle between the Wehrmacht and Montgomery in North Africa at Alamein. But we are being attacked. We're being undone in a very different way.
When you think of war, you probably imagine things like tanks, troops, explosions, death. But if you fell out with a state that had a more powerful military than yours, or if you wanted to avoid the cost of a full-on armed conflict, you'd probably try to think of other ways to win an argument. That's where the grey zone comes in. It's a place where there are no rules, and literally anything can be and is used as a weapon. Think about the information you absorb, the politicians you elect, even the technology you use. Just imagine the power you'd have if you were able to make people think a certain way, or vote for a certain party, or control their mobile phone, laptop, or car. You could change the fate of a nation without needing to put a boot on the ground. So thank you ever so much for speaking to me for this Grey Zone podcast. I'm sitting socially distanced in a room in London with General Sir Nick Carter, the head of the UK's armed forces, and Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary. You say we aren't in a state of peace and we're not in a state of war. What are we in?
Contest. We're competing against every day. Some people compete within the rules and some people compete outside the norms or the rules that we've all got used to.
That's Ben Wallace.
Every day we see our adversaries using cyber tools against us, using disinformation into our society, in some areas using financial corruption, using organised crime to divide us, to weaken us, or to compete with us.
I ask him and General Carter what the risk is if we don't recognise and do something about this often invisible threat. The military chief responds first.
So on the one hand, we might wake up one day and discover that we are in a police state and all of our freedoms have been denied us. That's one end of it. The other end of it is that our opponents will have found a way to unravel our democracy from inside, and our freedom, our way of life, and all the things that we espouse will have been undermined, and we won't have noticed it.
Without a shot being fired. That successful grey zone warfare from adversaries is that they know that if they can do all of those things, they might not have to commit a gun or a tank or anything. And they will have done it using proxies, done it through cyber, done it through crippling an economy. And then if you did want to drive in one day with your armour brigade, there's not much left to get in the way.
General Carter says the grey zone could also spark a full-on armed conflict. What is the biggest threat in the grey zone?
Miscalculation. Because what you're having here is a significant amount of activity, which is below the threshold of what we would call war. But the risk of that activity being misunderstood, or indeed escalation occurring as a consequence of it, that ends up lighting a fuse, is the thing that is most worrying. And of course, if you look back over history, it's those moments of miscalculation which often precipitate what ends up being an uncontrollable state of war. And that's the bit that we really, really have to watch.
The whole concept of what warfare can be, and therefore what the threat looks like, is changing. Try to think of the grey zone as a global battlefield. The front line is everywhere, and no one is too unimportant to be a target. Opposing sides are blurred, with governments, big business, and criminal gangs all using the same kind of tactics to attack each other and everyone else. The weapons of choice include deliberately crafted lies spread online, cyber hacks and bribes. But the grey zone has many physical dimensions too. At the sharp end, there are assassinations to eliminate someone who perhaps poses a threat or is causing a problem. There's also energy. Countries with oil and gas could use it to pressure nations that rely on their power to act a certain way, or perhaps turn a blind eye to a certain wrong. Grey zone warfare touches corporations too. Imagine you're a small firm manufacturing a clever piece of technology that's used by a larger company which, say, happens to be building sensitive military equipment for the UK government. A Chinese firm wants to buy you for a decent price, and you accept. But what then if relations between the UK and China become fraught? A way for Beijing to harm London could be to use this Chinese-owned British company to sabotage the kit with faulty technology, or technology that includes spyware, which is able to look at what the British government is doing. When you start to think about all the different ways to hurt another nation short of war, the grey zone options are literally endless. Back to Graham Lamb. If you were the ruler of a rogue state and you had all the levers of power at your disposal, how would you go about undoing a democracy?
You don't just go against the military. You don't just stand up with the equivalent of 12 carrier groups, like the America's got, or an opposite number to an F-35 strike fighter. What you do is you work on all the other things, which is this grey zone, the sort of what I call hybrid, the warfare people can't find the word for, but it's all this other stuff, where you're operating by design through diplomatic channels, through intelligence channels, through information in the media, through, in fact, political channels, through economic channels, where you're undoing confidence in an economy.
In the grey zone, the whole point is to cause harm to your enemy and gain an advantage without them feeling sufficiently threatened or realizing they're under attack.
There's that great maxim that says, if you want to boil a frog, you don't drop it into boiling water because it'll jump straight out again. You put it in cold water and you slowly bring the water up to boil. In doing so, by the time the frog realizes it's getting too hot, it's lost the energy to be able to jump out. We're being boiled like a frog.
Security is something most people in Western democracies take for granted. They probably don't worry about dying in a bomb blast or a gunfight when stepping outside their front door. Food is almost always in the shops, petrol is in the pumps, and power is pretty much guaranteed to flow through your home with the flick of a switch. The coronavirus pandemic has corrected this complacency a little, but people still generally expect to live securely, though perhaps now with a stockpile of toilet roll. In Western democracies, there's also the protection of the rule of law, the freedom to speak, and governance by democratically elected and accountable politicians. But these aren't divine rights. If people fail to protect them, they will falter, especially when those operating in the grey zone choose to exploit a society's vulnerabilities.
People are coming here to kill our people. They are absolutely killing our way of life because they're bringing doubt, misinformation, all the sort of normal stuff you see in the cyber world and all the rest. They bring in this constant message of we're not good enough, we're not fit for, divide and rule. So you separate the parts of Britain, you separate the individuals within the country, and suddenly, in fact, now they're malleable. So these things are absolutely under attack by others who wish to gain an advantage, whether it's a criminal, whether it's a proxy, whether it's a militia, whether it's a rogue nation, whether it's in fact a functioning state which sits down and uses its veto or it uses its own authority, its own capabilities, which are, in the cyber world, significant to therefore, in fact, what I call undo world order.
It's what's happening now